Hello, my name is Professor Sarah Jones, and I work in the Department of Modern Languages here at the University of Birmingham. And my lecture today has the title Creative Selves, Testimony, Authenticity and Engaging Others. This lecture is really more of a story. It's a story about the work that I did with a group of incredible international artists on a project with the title Testimony in Practice. It's an account of work done over several years, involving numerous outputs and activities and extensive relationships with non-academic partners who are also experts in their field. Now, my focus is going to be on the production of a collaborative piece of theatre with the title A Land Full of Heroes, a title taken from the work of the Romanian and German novelist Carmen Francesca Bonciu. It's also, however, a story about me, about how working with partners outside of academia taught me new skills and knowledge, taught me to think in a new way, to think differently about my discipline and about academia in general. In this way, this lecture about testimony is also a testimony itself. For this reason, there is far more of me in this talk than is traditionally expected from the genre of academic lecture. However, that too is an ethical and a political position. Surely, transformative research should also transform the researcher. I don't really know when my engagement with testimony as a subject started, but for the purposes of this story, I will start with my book, The Media of Testimony, Remembering East German Stasi in the Berlin Republic, which was published in 2014. The book examines the ways in which victims and perpetrators gave first-person accounts about their contact with the Stasi in different media forms. I looked at autobiographical writing, memorial museums, and documentary films. It is my most recent monograph, and it came 3 years after my first one. The third one is finally nearly finished, but the long gap was filled not only by the planned arrival of 2 children, but also by the unplanned investment of energy in impact work in theatre, art, and education. Now, the impact work was unplanned in part because it's not really very obvious how a quite theoretically heavy book on memories of the Stasi can change the world. However, it is in fact those concepts relating to authenticity, mediation, and empathy that I developed in the book, which ended up being central to the impact work. Now, I say I developed them in the book, but that too is a simplification. I developed them in the book, but also in and through the relationships with scholars and practitioners across disciplines and sectors involved in the AHRC network, Culture and its Uses of Testimony, which ran from 2016 to 2019, and of which I was principal investigator. In many cases, it was with those same practitioners that I later delivered impactful work, the theatre work described in this lecture, but also collaborations with the community arts organisation and national Holocaust education providers. The influence of these practitioners is also seen in the academic outputs that emerged from this network, which simultaneously underpinned the impact. I think we can see then from this brief discussion how central relationships are to cross-sector collaboration. A focus on relationality also underpinned the concepts themselves. The idea of witnessing is twofold. On the one hand, there's the passive form, the being present at an event, and on the other, there is the active form, giving an account of the event, of that same event for somebody who wasn't there. Now, we are, as academics and practitioners, most often dealing with the latter. A witness speaks or writes about something she has experienced for the benefit of an audience who was not there, but who must make some kind of judgment about it. In doing so, she must translate her experiences into words, which in turn must be interpreted by the listener. This creates what's been described as the veracity gap, which results from the fact that words can be exchanged, but experiences cannot. Paul Frosch suggests that we overcome the problem of the veracity gap by shifting our attention from the relationship between witness and event to the relationship between the witnessing text and its audience. This shift in focus means we have to rethink key concepts in the study of testimony towards a model that we might describe as, in different ways, relational. And I'm going to touch briefly on 4 of these in this lecture today: authenticity, embodiment, fictionality, and empathy. Turning first then to authenticity. Testimony is intimately bound up with questions of authenticity. It's long been recognised that testimony cannot reasonably be evaluated on the basis of historical accuracy. The vagaries of memory, particularly traumatic memory, mean that witnesses often make mistakes in their accounts of the past. And yet we do expect witnessing texts to be authentic in a particular way. We expect witnesses to give an account of their past as they experienced it and remembered it. Mistakes are acceptable. Lies are not. This is what in this model distinguishes testimony from fiction. Fiction does not make the same claim to referentiality. But this actually raises a number of questions. Who gets to decide whether the witness is giving an account of her past that is authentic by this measure? How do we distinguish between lies and misremembering? It is in these questions that we begin to see the relational aspects of authenticity. We believe witness testimony because we find it believable, and that believability is based on the witness herself and the authority that she is granted to speak about a particular subject. Indeed, this too is dialogic. The granting of the status of witness is also a process of granting authority, and it is in this process that we can see part of the power of testimony and its potential impact in post-conflict societies. When the victims of human rights abuses are given the chance to speak and not only be heard, but also believed, for example, in court, in mass archives of video recordings, memorial museums, or indeed through art, they are also granted the status of one who tells, or at least attempts to tell, the truth, and whose voice will help determine how the past is remembered. This is a form of what's called restorative justice, as the witness moves from a position of subalternity to a position of voice. Now, one of the key features of authenticity in witnessing is that of presence and the body. The witness is granted this authority by virtue of having been present at an event, and her body is seen as a trace of the past, as evidence that it took place. Moreover, the gold standard of witnessing is often felt to be a live encounter with the witness. The presence of the witness then, in the past, but also now, and the body serving as a link between past and present. The value placed on live witnessing over the body, and the body over all other forms is seen especially in Holocaust education, as evidenced by the considerable effort that has gone into designing technology that attempts to recreate that experience as we are faced with the impending loss of the witness generation. See, for example, the Forever project developed by the National Holocaust Center and Museum, which via a database of hundreds of pre-recorded answers to a wide range of questions, allows students to have the experience of interacting with survivor testimony, even in the absence of a survivor. Indeed, witness testimony needs to circulate across time and space if it is to have a wide audience and impact. And to do that, it has to be mediated, recorded in a way that permits wider distribution. However, we see a problem here. With the increasing mediation of witness testimony comes an increasing risk that the listener will perceive it as less authentic, as they are ever more distanced from the witness or perceive themselves to be so. Mediators, that is, filmmakers, curators, archivists, theatre producers, and so on, therefore use particular strategies to encourage their audiences to believe the witnessing text, and by proxy, the witness. In my book about memories of the Stasi, I explore these as what I call complementary authenticities. Firstly, there is witness authenticity, that is, using people, places, buildings, etc., that were really there. Then there is experiential authenticity, that is, reconstructions and immersive experiences. And finally, the authenticity of affect, that is, encouraging people to mimic the emotions of the witness. The complementary authenticities work together to increase the transparency of the medium, to give a sense of being really there, that really there is not only the time of the witnessed event, it is also the time of the witnessing act. To give a couple of examples, the Memorial Museum located in the former Stasi remand prison in Berlin, Memorial Berlin-Hohenschönhausen, makes extensive use of eyewitness guides. The guides, buildings, and many of the objects have witness testimony. They were really there. This combines with a reconstruction of the prison buildings and cells to look as they did at the time of their use, rather than as they were found, and a tendency of the guides to reenact scenes from prison life, such as interrogations or verbal abuse by the guards, both forms of experiential authenticity. Finally, the guides interweave general accounts of the prison's history with personal narratives that elicit an affective response in both speaker and listener. Documentary films with talking heads work in a similar way. Individuals who lived through the experiences described, photographs and found footage, all have witness testimony, and that these are intercut then with reenactments of particular scenes, sometimes in a way that is difficult to distinguish from the found footage. The selection of testimony often focuses on the emotional elements, including moments of emotional breakdown on the part of the witness. The transparency of the medium encourages the viewer to mimic that emotion. When they are crying, we are crying. Complementary authenticities are a powerful way not only of having a story believed, but also of encouraging a political response on the part of the viewer by incorporating them into what I term a mediated remembering community. However, as we'll see, that aim might be undermined if the audience is overwhelmed by their own feelings of anger and sadness, and therefore unable to focus on the political and social causes behind the violent histories of which the witnessing text gives an account. Believability then, and therefore authenticity, is based on the witnessing text itself and what Smith and Watson have described as the metrics of authenticity. The recognition that authenticity is constructed in a relationship between witnessing text and audience also leads us back to the question of fiction. If a reader, listener, or viewer believes a fictional text to be an authentic representation of the author's personal experiences, does that make it so? Hayden White uses the term figural realism to describe the ways in which Primo Levi interweaves elements of fiction into his account of surviving Auschwitz. This is not a fiction in the sense of being imaginary, rather it is the use of literary devices, as White puts it, rhetorical figures, conceits and tropes, in which nature is anthropomorphized, the human subject diminished, and the atmosphere, both physical and spiritual, charged with malign intention. This form of fictionalization is, however, rather different to the case of what Jeffrey Hartman has described as authentic fakes. This seemingly paradoxical term refers to works such as Benjamin Wilkomirski's Fragments, Memories of a Wartime Childhood, which was published as an autobiographical account of a child living through the Holocaust, and which was initially received as a powerfully authentic representation. However, it was received that Wilkomirski had not, in fact, had the experiences recounted in Fragments. The book was withdrawn and later released as a novel. Authentic fakes, such as Fragments, do feel deeply deceptive. They are an appropriation of traumatic experience, and they open the door for Holocaust denial. It is not that writers who are not survivors should not write about the Holocaust. However, it is deeply unethical if they claim that they are doing so on the basis of personal experience. If Fragments had been announced as a fiction from the start, it is entirely possible that it would still have been received as an authentic representation. However, it would have been recognized as the authenticity of fiction and not the authenticity of testimony. Nonetheless, this is also quite distinct to works in text, film, or on stage that draw on the experience of survivors, the author's own or other people, to tell stories that have an affinity to lived experience, but which do not claim an identity with it. This might include literary authors who write their own lives in fictional form, as is the case with Carmen Francesca Bonciu. Carmen Francesca has described this interweaving between fiction and testimony in a contribution to the handbook that is emerging from the culture and its uses as testimony network. She says, After writing several books, I understood that whatever I am writing about and whichever voice I use to communicate my experiences, searches, and discoveries, it is always a way to give testimony about myself and implicitly about the others. Me, I, is the construct called writer, who comprises multiple identities, living several lives at the same time, possibly having a controversial, complex character. Someone navigating between reality and fiction, between subjectivity and objectivity, trying to understand life and express it in a meaningful, truthful, multifaceted way, giving in their particular way testimony. Writers choose to fictionalize their stories for a variety of reasons, to distance themselves from painful experiences by passing those experiences to a fictional other, to intertwine fiction and reality in a way that situates their individual experience in a wider historical context, or simply to tell a more compelling story. It seems to me that we can nonetheless read these works as a form of testimony that makes available to survivors the possibility of giving an account of their experiences that is both less risky for them as individuals and which allows them to condense complex emotions in a way that only the poetic form makes possible. The discussion of authenticity, and particularly complementary authenticities, also feeds into our understanding of empathy. Empathy is often cited as a reason for using first-person testimony in cultural and educational initiatives that aim to promote a better understanding of the past and recognition of the pain of the other. The idea is that we can identify with the story of a single individual, especially one who is or appears to be standing in front of us, better than with the anonymous mass of victims. This view is promoted especially in Holocaust education, with some basis in research. The UCL Centre for Holocaust Education's 2016 report, What Do Students Know and Understand About the Holocaust?, noted in their large-scale survey of over 8,000 students in UK secondary schools that 89.4% agreed or strongly agreed that hearing a survivor speak had made the Holocaust feel more real, 87.5% indicated they had found the experience upsetting, and 81.8% agreed it had helped their understanding of how or why the Holocaust took place. Empathy is quite clearly relational. It's about our own emotional response in relation to those of another individual, in this case, the witness survivor. But what does empathy really mean, and how useful is it, in fact? I found the work of philosopher Amy Copeland extremely helpful in this regard. Copeland identifies 7 different but loosely related processes or mental states that are understood as empathy. 1, feeling what someone else feels. 2, caring about someone else. 3, being emotionally affected by someone else's emotions and experiences, though not necessarily experiencing the same emotions. 4, imagining oneself in another's situation. 5, imagining being in that other's situation. 6, making inferences about another's mental states, and 7, some combination of the processes described in 1 to 6. However, Copeland argues that genuine empathy must take a particular form. It must be, and I quote, a complex imaginative process in which an observer simulates another person's situated psychological states while maintaining clear self-other differentiation. Empathy in this understanding must be other-oriented. We must be able to understand the pain of someone else as they would feel it, not as our own pain. If empathy is not other-oriented, the observer risks what Copeland describes as personal distress or emotional distress, focused on themselves rather than on the suffering of the other and its causes. This might in turn limit any active political response. So productive empathy requires distance, and the creation of testimony through art can foster just such distance. Done well, artistic forms such as fiction, theatre or film bring attention to their own mediation, their own literariness. When they stage testimony, they draw the audience into the story being told, but they also set the audience at a distance by making clear the mediated nature of the encounter. So these are the key theoretical concepts that emerged from the writing of my book, but also emerged through the relationships developed after that work had been completed. Indeed, I thought I was done with testimony once the book was published. However, I was very wrong, not only because of the impact work that came after, but also because the impact work made me rethink and extend the ideas in that book. So what was that cross-sector impact work? To tell this story, we need to find another starting point. I could choose the summer of 2015, when I was holding my newborn baby with one hand and trying to put together an overdue network application with the other, writing invitations to participate and trying to ensure a mixture of academics from across disciplines and collaborators from other sectors. I'd known Carmen Francesca for several years. The Catalan theatre company La Conquesta del Pol Sud were recommended to me by another colleague. Or perhaps it's better to fast forward to November 2016. That's the date we usually use when we tell the story of the play. It was the time of the first network workshop. Carmen Francesca was there, along with La Conquesta's set designer, Eugenio Schwarzer. I quite casually suggested that they should work together to stage a play about Carmen Francesca's experiences as a dissident author in communist Romania, and her decision to move to Germany in 1990, just as the country and the continent were beginning to unite. I thought that it would be interesting to explore what would happen if literary testimony was combined with verbatim theatre of the kind produced by La Conquesta. I thought that Carmen Francesca's life story was exactly the one that needed to be telling around the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. The idea became ever more concrete through the second and then third project workshops. By the third workshop, held on a swelteringly hot day in May 2017, I was 37 weeks pregnant with my second child, a baby who arrived in a hurry and refused to sleep for more than 20 minutes at a time. Needless to say, the project was put on hold for a few months. Such a thing is, of course, expensive. The play, I mean, though babies too. The best way to fund it seemed to be with an AHRC follow-on grant for impact and engagement. But to make that application credible, we needed to embed the creation of the play in a series of community and artistic engagement activities to ensure that it achieved measurable impact. In the end, we agreed that alongside the play, we would run a series of workshops for artistic practitioners, a testimonies campaign, and an exhibition with the Central and Eastern European arts space, Centrala. And we got the green light from the AHRC in December 2018. For La Conquesta, a central part of their practice is the road trips. That is, journeys that they take as a team to learn more about the cultural, social, and historical context in which their witness stories take place. In the case of our play, which at this point had the title Bucharest, La Conquesta took 2 road trips. The first retraced Carmen Francesca's journey from Bucharest to Berlin in 1990, a journey she took to receive a literary award, but which ended up being a life and literature-changing decision to make Berlin her home and German the language in which she would write. Eugenio and La Conquesta's director, Carles Fernandez-Guia, travelled by car through the many major cities and sites of memory between Bucharest and Berlin, gathering impressions and images. I, on the other hand, sat in my office in Birmingham, sending tips and advice by WhatsApp, feeling envious that I could not join them. For the second trip, we did, however, go to Bucharest as a group. Carmen Francesca, Carles, Eugenio and I. We travelled the city together, visiting places that were important to Carmen Francesca, her literature, and to the historical events that it represents. And we talked. The purpose of the visit was exactly that, for Carmen Francesca to talk, to give testimony about the things she had experienced, and to help us understand it better. I think the most impactful day for all of us was the visit to Ferentori, a still extremely deprived neighbourhood in Bucharest, in which Carmen Francesca had lived 35 years previously in a 9-metre-squared apartment with her husband and 2 children. We walked the neighbourhood trying to find that space. The neighbours were very suspicious of us, of the camera and of our questions. That is, until they heard that we were speaking English, German, Spanish, but not Romanian, at least not to each other. The people living in Carmen Francesca's old flat were happy to let us in and even to film. Later, we visited the small house in the same neighbourhood to which Carmen Francesca was able to move after leaving the squalid apartment. A man approached us straight away, and I assumed he was unhappy about the camera. In fact, he was an old friend of Carmen Francesca's. It was as if the last 30 years had not happened. More stories, more explanations, more testimony that is not in Carmen Francesca's books, but which helped me to understand them. Carmen Francesca describes the impact of this trip in a short film we made about the project, The Making of a Land Full of Heroes. She says, "Going back to Ferentari meant for me like being projected back in time more than 35 years. And I felt like going through a tunnel into another time, and I had a fear suddenly that I am disconnected from reality, from the real time, from the present, and that I can be trapped there forever in this moment, in a time that has a very big impact on my emotions even today." For Carmen Francesca, the experience of performing in the play was ultimately beneficial. She describes how she freed herself from the initial panic during the rehearsals, realizing that she just needed to be herself. Nonetheless, this initial response to being thrust back into her past life is a reminder not only of the embodied nature of testimony also for the witness, but of the ethical responsibilities of those mediating testimony. Emily Pine was co-investigator on the follow-on project. She's a professor in modern drama at University College Dublin. She's also the author of the best-selling and multiply translated book of personal essays, Notes to Self, also a form of testimony. Emily's most recent academic book explores what she describes as the memory marketplace. She notes that memory, especially traumatic memory, sells. That is, that we need to consider that stories of painful pasts are not just told, but sold, not just received, but bought, not just mediated and remediated, but commodified. Emily opens her book with a description of a land full of heroes. She quotes Carmen Francesca in the part of the play when she describes her journey from Bucharest to Berlin. She is driven by writer friends who want to capture her emotions on crossing the border. She says, "They will pay the bills during the trip. This is part of our deal. I should talk, disclose. I'm not even aware that I'm selling my impressions, that I'm practicing for the first time in life in the market economy, in capitalism." That was in 1990. In 2019, Carmen Francesca was well practiced in selling her impressions in capitalism, and her comments here indicate that she is conscious that this is what she is doing also in a land full of heroes. Nonetheless, it is imperative for those working with witnesses to consider carefully the economic, cultural, and social power dynamics in our relationships before we ask anyone to go back through a tunnel into another time. Back in Ferentari, Carlos asked me what I thought about how we could represent literary testimony on stage. "The narrator," I said. "The narrator is and is not Carmen Francesca. She is Maria Maria, the recurring protagonist in Carmen Francesca's books. That second narrative voice is so important in Carmen Francesca's literature in terms of testimony through fiction. Can we represent that on stage?" Meda Gheorghiu-Bonciu is a professional actor. She is also Carmen Francesca's daughter. Where in La Conquista's previous works the witness has been on stage alone or on occasion with Eugenio or Carlos, in A Land Full of Heroes, Carmen Francesca performed alongside her daughter. Meda acted as the young Carmen Francesca, as Maria Maria, performing on the literary texts themselves, and as herself, a member of the younger generation, born in Berlin, curious about the communist past and what it means for the present. As Carlos put it, "It's a new language. Mix these two territories, these two levels of fiction, literary fiction and action fiction. It's new for us. But also work with literary testimony implies a higher level of elaboration of the experience. Because Carmen Francesca has done a poetic elaboration of her experience, there is a poetic level that in other pieces we don't have." The play intertwines testimony as fiction, testimony produced by Carmen Francesca and Meda for the play itself and in the process of the rehearsals, footage from road trips, including reflections of Carlos and Eugenio, dance, song, and numerous images. It is a highly self-conscious mediation of real-life experience, and yet also a powerful expression of that experience. It blurs the boundaries between fiction and testimony in a way that makes clear that fiction can be an authentic form of testimony. It makes use of embodiment, but also draws attention to the mediated nature of that embodiment through, in Carlos's words, some very strange moments on stage. He says, we can see Meda performing on the literary text of Carmen Francesca. She's performing as an actress. And on the other side, we can see Carmen Francesca with all the weight of her experience. The play was premiered at the Birmingham European Festival in July 2019. Reviewer Dorothy Max Pryor summed it up as an extraordinary piece that proves that political theatre can use a cross-art form approach and experiment in form while simultaneously conveying the truth of real-life, historical and biographical experience. Lauren Cole notes that sometimes it was difficult to tell where the character of Maria Maria ended and the personal accounts from Bonchu began, but this only added to the fluid and mesmerising nature of the piece. We might summarise, the play draws you into Carmen Francesca's life, literature and experiences, giving you the opportunity to empathise with the woman on stage, yet you are also held at a distance by a piece that makes you think and rethink about the relationship between fiction, fact, authenticity, testimony and art. These would seem to be the ideal conditions to foster the kind of other-oriented empathy that has the potential to be politically productive. I have, of course, left a great deal out of this story. I've not included the other outputs that we worked on together and in cooperation with the other major partners in the follow-on project, Centrala Space. These included workshops for theatre practitioners, writers and youth artists, a testimonies campaign, a visual arts exhibition, a clock tower projection, a written guide for practitioners. But it's not just activity that is missing from this account. I've also not mentioned the moments of conflict and anxiety that are perhaps inevitable in working collaborations, especially across sectors. Impact work is hard for the same reason it is rewarding, because it is about relationships, about creating something together with partners whose motivations may not always be identical with our own. In this way, it's also about creating and recreating ourselves. We might also think about the ways in which working with partners outside of academia changes the research itself. This can be a point of concern, particularly when it's powerful partners determining what is researched and how, for example, policymakers engage with social science researchers. However, if we can reconceptualize impact in relational terms as a process of transaction and interaction in which both parties are transformed, we might be able to see the potentially positive outcomes of these collaborations also for the researcher and the research. We need to recognise the messiness, the dialogical and complex nature of the exchange of expertise and experience in cross-sector collaboration in order to foster terms of engagement that genuinely break down the barriers between the academy and the world. Thank you.